So at 5 o'clock this morning, a very disheveled-looking President Barack Obama appeared before the White House press corps. He was wearing a red Superman cape, a blue T-shirt and flip-flops, and he had matching Superman boxer shorts. And he announced his resignation from the presidency, saying that he had to resign because the American people are unworthy of him and they no longer believe in his magical powers. Now, Albert Einstein said that imagination is more important than knowledge. And I know many of you here may object, well, you're not Albert Einstein, and what you just said is completely ridiculous. And I would say, well, that's true, because when Barack Obama resigns, I think Valerie Jarrett is going to make him dress up in a suit and tie. But many of you here would say, well, that'll never happen. Really? The interesting thing about pessimism is that people who are pessimistic actually are usually in denial about how bad things actually are. For example, probably many of you here who think that we can't remove Barack Obama from the White House before the next elections also probably think that it's an exaggeration to say that we're headed for a thermonuclear World War III. They would never let that happen. That would be crazy. Do people know what would happen if you had a nuclear war? That would never happen. Never mind. And people have this view that somehow we can do a clean strike. We'll just do one little nuclear bomb on Iran. It'll be over in 24 hours. No one will follow up. Never mind that hundreds of thousands of Russian civilians and scientists live in Syria and Iran. And never mind that the British said that since the Russians have violated something or other, which they made up, that if they are to launch strikes on Syria or Iran, they don't think they're going to tell the Russians before it happens. And that the Russian Navy has now been moved. Most of their very advanced naval fleet is in the Mediterranean at their port in Syria. So why is it that people are so very certain that we could not have a nuclear war? I'm certain that if someone had told the people of Germany that there's no way that someone had told the people of Germany that Adolf Hitler would be rounding people up and sending them to gas chambers where they were going to be euthanized and burned up in incinerators, people would have said, that is just a conspiracy theory. That's crazy. That'll never happen. Well, did it happen? In July of 2007, LaRouche made a famous forecast. He said that there was no way at this point that a collapse of the international banking system could be avoided. And later in the summer, he drafted something called the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act, which had as its basis a reenactment of Glass-Steagall and was a moratorium on foreclosures. And hundreds of city councils, dozens of state legislatures held hearings, passed resolutions in support of this. But stupid popular opinion, as voiced by Barney Frank, prevented LaRouche's bill from being introduced in the Congress. Barney Frank went so far as to say that it was unconstitutional for the banks not to be allowed to throw people out of their homes. And as people know, what he said was it wasn't that bad, and he had another bailout plan, which is, you may know, 1.3 or 2 trillion or however many $1 trillion later the Barney Frank bailout of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was. We have now had over 9 million foreclosures in this country, and at least half of those are where people actually get thrown out of their houses. So who was exaggerating? Thank God Rachel Brown took care of Barney Frank, and he's not running again. So what about thermonuclear war? First of all, have you ever stopped to think about what a thermonuclear war would look like? And I know that the baby boomer generation has been behavior modified to be against anything that has the word nuclear in it. You were subjected to all of those bomb drills, hiding under your chairs. And of course, I don't know exactly how hiding under a desk or chair would protect you during a nuclear war, but you weren't supposed to ask that question. But when I was young, I grew up in a New England Quaker household, and my father was a really extreme environmentalist, so the house was kept absolutely freezing. And in the morning, you were allowed to go downstairs and turn on the thermostat, and the hot air would come up. And so I used to dry my hair on the floor looking up, and on the bookshelf right above my head, my parents kept 2 books that were written by the survivors of the nuclear bombs dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I will not detail here what happened to the people who were not fortunate enough to be killed instantaneously, but what that looks like and what people experienced is something that no human being and no animal should ever be forced to suffer. This is why Obama has to be removed. Iran and Syria are not a threat to the United States. They're also not a threat to Israel, because they're not stupid. They know what would happen if they were to attack Israel. And after the murder of Gaddafi, LaRouche said this unleashes World War III. This murder of Gaddafi, remember, he was already in captivity. He was already in custody. He had already been beaten, tortured, and then he was shot. That is a war crime. And it unleashed a new level. LaRouche knew at that moment that we were headed to World War III. And particularly as Americans, you should think what it means if the United States is going to behave in such a flagrantly unjust way. Don't we value the principles in our Constitution? The whole war with Libya was a war crime. It was never authorized by the U.S. Congress. So now you have a situation where you're hearing in the media, it's a replay of what we heard about Iraq. Remember that? They're going to have a missile and it can hit anywhere in the world in 45 minutes. They're going to blow up the world. Well, now we're hearing this about Iran. And in Iran, what you have is a nuclear power plant. It just started operating in September. The Russians were involved in completing it. You have many Russian scientists on the ground there. So think about what it means. This targeting of Iran and Syria has absolutely nothing to do with Iran and Syria. It is a war, would be a war between the U.S. and Russia, and the U.S. and Russia and China. On top of that, we are moving major anti-ballistic missile defense systems, including offensive weapons, into Eastern Europe. And they're pointing toward Russia. And we're claiming to the Russians that Russia's not the target. We're moving all of these missiles right up to your border because we're afraid of a threat from Iran or North Korea. Now, if the Russians began putting a whole bunch of anti-ballistic missile systems in Mexico on the border of Arizona and Texas, and they were aiming right into the United States, and then they said they were doing this because they were concerned about a threat from Nigeria, how many people would believe that? So 3 weeks ago, the president of Russia, President Medvedev, made a very clear, very sharp national television address with English subtitles to make sure that Americans could understand it, where he said that he welcomed the initial shift in the Obama administration where it looked like we were not going to be putting all these missiles on their border, but somehow this had all been changed, that he really very much hoped that there could be a dialogue between NATO, the U.S. on one side, and Russia on the other, and they could come to some mutual agreement on the defense of Europe. But since the United States did not seem to be interested in talking, and since the U.S. and NATO have refused to provide any written documentation that these missile systems are not directed at Russia, he said they have no choice, so that the early attack warning system in Kaliningrad has been placed on combat alert, and that Russia is moving their missiles internally to be sure that they are honed in on military installations in Western Europe. And he did this on national television to try and get a message through to people here. In other words, they're not sneaking around. They're saying, you're sneaking around, and here's what we are forced to do if you don't wise up. So in the United States, and because of LaRouche and because of the Russians being so clear, the U.S. military actually mobilized. And because of the mobilization, with LaRouche hammering on people to not be naive, and the U.S. military fighting, they don't want nuclear war. What you had is phase one, which would have been some kind of surprise attack on Iran. That didn't work. We threw off the timing. But it's not over. And furthermore, Obama's ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder, who apparently was educated in London and went to Harvard, gave an interview in the New York Times where he said people really shouldn't worry about this Medvedev speech. It's just an election ploy. You know, like people move nuclear missiles around to try and get votes. I mean, the only person I can think of who would use nuclear war as an election ploy is Barack Obama. And then to make matters worse, he's running his administration like a satanic gang where people have to pass loyalty oaths and revoke things that they believed in. So our Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, was ordered to utter statements questioning the honesty of the Russian elections. And then her statements were exploited all over the press to elicit a response from Russia's Prime Minister Putin, who blamed her for inciting the riots in Russia. Now, remember, Hillary Clinton was the one, when Obama first came in, who made the famous visit to Europe, met with the Russians, and said, we're going to press the restart button. She had reversed the Bush administration policy to put all these missile systems on their borders, and now, under Obama, is threatened into eating her words and saying these insane, incendiary things. Happily, because of LaRouche's very sharp intervention, this thing did not blow up. So, you may ask, how is it that we're going to get, if this lunatic is able to control so much, how are we going to get this guy out of power? I mean, after all, who are we in this room? Aren't we just, isn't each one of us just one little person? Do we have any power? Do I have any power? And that's the question. What is power? The great German poet and philosopher Friedrich Schiller wrote a very profound and beautiful essay on this topic. It's called On the Sublime, which addresses the question of the difference between brute force and what actually constitutes power. And he begins his essay by quoting, "No man must." In other words, that human beings possess free will and can choose through their free will. Human beings are not subject to nature. We can act against nature. For example, a firefighter who risks his life, endures massive discomfort to rush into a burning building to save someone that he never met before. He's acting from a higher standpoint, which is the principle of the sacredness of human life. But what about force? What about things that are more powerful? Like, take your cat. If anyone's ever tried putting their cat on a leash, you know it doesn't work very well. The cat runs under the couch, or it sits down, or rolls over. But you can pick up the cat and you can carry it somewhere and force it to go where you want because you're stronger. Well, Schiller takes this question up as well, because there's one force, one end, which seemingly no one is going to escape, which is death. So how can human beings possess free will and not prevent themselves from dying? And this is the real question of a sublime individual and the question of courage. Because a sublime soul, an individual who has chosen to act from that standpoint, at the moment that death is unavoidable, chooses to make death his own act. So if you think about someone like Joan of Arc, who had a choice, she could have avoided being burned at the stake if she was willing to renounce her divine inspiration. So she could have lied to save her own skin. And had she done that, she might have lived. There never would have been a nation of France. But she chose to die. She accepted death, so that even though they burned her at the stake, she was the one who was victorious. And France is a nation because of that. And if you think about presidents like Abraham Lincoln or President Kennedy, they possessed a similar quality. They may not have known, it didn't come down to the wire in the same way as Joan of Arc, but certainly they knew that their policies had very powerful enemies. They knew that they had been threatened with death, and they decided that they were going to continue with their policies in spite of the danger to their personal lives. And interestingly enough, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, 4 years after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And we landed on the moon in 1969, which was 6 years after Kennedy was assassinated. So the British assassins of our presidents turned out to be less powerful than the principles which the presidents represented, which resonated in the hearts and minds of the American people. And to give you an example of that, people probably are somewhat familiar with this speech that Lincoln gave, which was long before he was president. It was December 26th, the day after Christmas, in 1839, and there was a huge fight going on the question of national banking, and everyone told him that he was going to lose. So this is from his speech. So-and-so confidently predicts that every state in the Union will vote for Mr. Van Buren at the next presidential election. Address that argument to cowards and to knaves. With the free and the brave, it will affect nothing. It may be true. If it must, let it. Many free countries have lost their liberty, and ours may lose hers. But if she shall, be it my proudest plume, not that I was the last to desert, but that I never deserted her. I know that the great volcano at Washington, aroused and directed by the evil spirit that reigns there, belching forth the lava of political corruption in a current broad and deep, which is sweeping with frightful velocity over the whole length and breadth of the land, bidding fair to leave no green spot or living thing, while on its bosom are riding like demons on the waves of hell, the imps of that evil spirit, and fiendishly taunting all those who dare to resist its destroying course with the hopelessness of their effort. And knowing this, I cannot deny that all may be swept away. Broken by it, I too may be. Bow to it, I never will. The probability that we may fall in the struggle ought not to deter us from the support of a cause we believe to be just. So that's Lincoln. That's his identity. It sounds a little bit like Washington today, I must say. So what causes a human being to do things anyway? If I put my arm up like this, why did it go up? Is it because there's some guy with a pulley back there who lifted my arm up? Or is it maybe because my brain issued some kind of electrical signal and another signal and another signal, and it caused some muscles to contract and other muscles to expand, and when I raised my arm, I didn't fall over, so a whole bunch of other muscles came into play and kept me balanced, and I was even able to continue speaking while I did this. So maybe we could get some computer to calculate it all and figure out how many millions of signals and cells were involved in this. Well, how come I was able to lift it when I wanted to lift it and not at some arbitrary time? Well, you could say, because I decided to do it. All right, well, where are the decision-making cells? And I know, don't say George Bush, he was the decider. But you can't, tell a brain surgeon to look inside my brain and try and scoop out the part that made the decision that I was going to lift my arm and then put it on a petri dish and figure out what it is. So the question is, what's more real? The motion of my arm or the intent in my mind when I decided to move my arm? And this is the question that's been taken up throughout history, and it's very ticklish, from Socrates to Schiller and Einstein and LaRouche. My intent is not perceivable by your senses, but it's the cause of an action which can be measured by your senses. Now, I am not suggesting that everyone here sit in a yoga lotus position and meditate on the removal of Barack Obama, because I don't think that that will work, and I think if everyone here decided to do that, he definitely would not be removed. But there is a connection, and it does mean to consider that every action has a cause, and in most cases, the cause of an action is invisible to our senses. But that doesn't mean that the cause is unknowable. And the challenge for human beings is for us to conduct our actions from the standpoint of reality, not from appearances or shadows, if we wish to survive. Abraham Lincoln was determined to win the Civil War because he imagined in his mind what the fate of mankind would be were the British Empire to succeed in splitting up our republic and for the British Empire running their slave trade and their opium trade to get control of the entire hemisphere. And because Lincoln could imagine in his mind what failure would look like, he knew that that war could not be lost. General Grant, who may have had a slightly different idea of the consequences of losing, nonetheless had an equally strong commitment that this war could not be lost. And therefore, General Grant was prepared, as people may know who know this history, to take absolutely massive losses, a bloody campaign through the wilderness, whatever it took to ensure that the war was won. On a recent tour of West Point, a professor told us that in all major wars, the side that suffers the greatest losses is the winning side. In other words, in a just war, in a war that's necessary, it's not how many people that you're willing to kill, but whether what you're fighting for is precious enough that you would be willing to die for it. And if it is that precious that you would die for it, then you know that you can't afford to lose. Now, of course, we cannot afford to have wars in that sense because we have nuclear weapons. So therefore, given the state of affairs in the world today, war is not an option. War is obsolete unless you want the human race to be extinct. Unfortunately, the United States and the world is suffering from a severe shortage of qualified leaders. And that's why LaRouche asked the 6 of us to run for Congress a year ago, and perhaps there's going to be more of us soon. And he made clear to us since then that we're not really running for Congress in the way that you'd think of it. We're not running for regional positions. Each one of us is running in a district, of course. But if you think about the role of the House of Representatives, what do? They deliberate on national policy. They vote on national policy. And as such, we are responsible for representing the good of the nation first. Also, if you look at the collapse of the economy, the collapse of civilization, the collapse of culture, there is nothing that can be solved by any local effort. Things that you think like unemployment, that's across the nation. Floods, that's across the nation. Extreme weather, that's across the nation. Foreclosures, it's a national question and an international question. And then if you want to think about the near miss we had with the giant asteroid, which went between the moon and the Earth, that's a global question, which really ought to be addressed if we're interested in surviving. I don't know why we should take it for granted that every gigantic asteroid is going to not hit this planet. So the most urgent issue that we have to address right now is not elections. It has to do with whether we can win the war in our own minds and our neighbors' minds, that the survival of the human species is at stake, and that it's worth fighting to save it. So I'm not proposing an armed militia. I'm calling for spiritual arms, that everyone should put aside, all of us, all of the comfortable, pessimistic, and fearful thoughts which prevent us from acting to cause this president to be constitutionally removed from office in time. Thank you.